Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you for attending this Brookings Doha Center, a panel on Iran. My name is Ali Fatullah Nejad. I'm a visiting fellow with the Brookings Doha Center. We're very pleased to have a very timely discussion on Iran's internal and external challenges. I'd like to thank my dear colleagues at the Brookings Doha Center who organized this wonderful event. I'm going to shortly explain to you the format. So we're going to have 90 minutes. The first hour will be devoted to a discussion among the panelists. And the last half an hour, you're all invited to participate in the discussion and to ask questions, but also, if you want, but very short comments. We're going to start by initial statements by the respective panelists. Before doing so, let me just briefly introduce them to you. To my left, Mr. Mohammad Kazem Sajjadpour. He's the president of the Iranian Institute for Political and International Studies, IPIS, which is the Iranian Foreign Ministry's think tank. From 2013 to 16, he was advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on strategic issues. Between 2003 and 2004, he was ambassador and deputy permanent representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran to the United Nations. He received his PhD in political disqualified by the Guardian Council. He also holds a PhD from the university in the United States, as all our panelists, by the way, and from Cornell. Last but not least, we're very happy to have Professor Shafiq Qabra, who is a professor of political science at the university. He's a former founding president of the American University of Kuwait, where he also directed the Center for Strategic Studies at Kuwait University, not at the AUK. He was also the former director of the Information Office of Kuwait in Washington, D.C., author of 8 books. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Texas at Austin. So I hope that despite the commonality of all our distinguished guests having a PhD from an American university, we're going to have some controversies as well. We're going to start with Professor Amir Ahmadi. I'd like to ask him about the internal challenges that Iran faces, especially after the revolt at the turn of the year, which saw the most politicized protests in the history of the Islamic Republic, and spanning over 90 mostly smaller cities, and were basically the working class poor were taking to the streets, as Asef Bayat, the famous academic, puts it. That is basically socioeconomic poor people who have middle-class qualifications and aspirations. And so they demanded not only socioeconomic justice, but also some political demands. And it's interesting to see the slogans of this revolt that can be categorized in 3 areas. 1, the demand for social justice. Secondly, a critique of basically all factions of the state. And thirdly, the combination between inside and outside factors, basically a criticism vis-a-vis Iran's regional policies and the failure to devote, for example, those funds for domestic problems. So, Professor Amir Ahmadi, let me ask you about your kind of reading of the revolt and its ramifications, but also 3 years ago, you wrote a piece in the National Interest, which was headlined, Rouhani's new budget offers pain without hope. And so maybe you can also say a few things about your criticism of President Rouhani's socioeconomic policies and economic policies that might be also relevant to why the revolt happened.
I have
Thank
to
you
get
so much.
permission from Syrian ambassador for doing that, but that's okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, good evening. I had planned to have a few pleasantries, but I'm going to have to give up because I don't have much time. I want just to thank the center for the invitation, Dr. Fatullah Najat for the kind introduction, and Mr. Qais Sharif for making a great arrangement for the travel and the rest of it. I had prepared about 15 minutes speech, but I'm just altering that and trying to give the basic points of it, answering your question. But to answer that question about the protests and my criticism of President Rouhani, we really need to take back you to the revolution itself. Some 40 years ago, Iranians had a revolution called the Islamic Revolution. This revolution was supposed to provide for political freedom, for economic justice and development, for national independence, particularly in foreign policy, and to create a healthy, corruption-free Islamic society. Unfortunately, I have to say, none of the above has been achieved, at least not to the extent that the Iranian people had expected and the price they had paid for these noble goals. Economically, Iran has not just only failed in social justice, that even absolute poverty has grown. 40% of Iranians live below poverty line as we speak. The gap between the rich and poor has never been this wide. You have billionaires with palaces on the northern Tehran and the small suburbs, and others who don't have a shelter to live in. But also, as President Rouhani just recently, after this protest, acknowledged very openly, he said, here is what he said. He said, I am sorry that we have failed to improve your economic lot. That in the last 5 years, he said, your income, per capita income, has declined, and that has reduced your purchasing power. Again, I am not saying that the president acknowledged. And he also said, please let us know what the solution is. I said, God forbid, the man doesn't know how to manage, and he doesn't have a solution. He's asking people for a solution. But anyway, so economically, Iranians haven't really achieved much. Let me just remind you that 40 years ago, Iran was either equal to or above in economic development side, similar to South Korea, to Turkey, India, China, Taiwan, and many others. Those days, Qatar, the UAE, and others were way at the bottom of the hierarchy. 40 years later, ladies and gentlemen, Iran is way behind all these nations, with some between 20 to 50 years behind. I think it's 50 years behind South Korea, maybe 20 years behind, some other countries, but it is behind. Iran moved back in the last 40 years, lost opportunity, tremendous lost opportunity. Politically also, the political freedom has ended up to become engineered periodic elections that take place between what we call the bad and the worst of the same political elite for 40 years, circling, recycling themselves, closing the society to anybody who is not with them. غير خودی. In terms of the national independence, I think the best example for me is the JCPOA, the comprehensive nuclear deal that made. It's the first instance in Iran's history that Iran gave up so much to a foreign power without being defeated in a war. Never Iran has given so much. Basically destroyed by its own hand an industry that its own people, kids, young engineers had built, putting concrete in that particular reactor. It burns my heart. And finally, in terms of a good, healthy society, it doesn't exist. Iran is filled with corruption, bribery, nepotism. The political elite is using corruption in many ways, including paying themselves billion salaries or million salaries, getting loans that are largely illegitimate from the banks, and just direct stealing. So, and then in the meantime, our youth is unemployed, is drug addicted, and I have to say, unfortunately, even our women are entering into the kind of practices that I shame to say in this meeting. But the bottom line, Iran, as we talk about it, is not doing well these days. Now, there are all kinds of pressure, domestic and international, on the government. The government blames largely sanctions, foreign intervention for the problems. But they also say that perhaps 20% of the problems are due to this foreign stuff, from sanctions to everything else. 80% of these problems come from mismanagement, a government that is lawless, has no discipline, and it doesn't really recycle itself the way it should. That is, create a political elite that can lead the country. This is what it is. Now, there are various groups in the country that are pushing for change. I believe the Islamic Republic has come to understand that the change is inevitable. The title of my own presentation is State Alteration or Societal Disruption. And I believe unless and until the Islamic Republic alters its basic structures, a revolution, a radical revolution, even more radical than 1979, is almost 100% inevitable. I could promise you here. I first predicted the protests a year ago at a meeting, at a speech at Cambridge University. I said there that Iran sits on a volcano that will erupt very soon. I repeated that promise of a revolution coming in many of my writings and in social media. And it came. But it came and it wasn't enough. That is to say, it was not big enough to make changes. But it is, I believe that protest was an introduction to that volcano that I am thinking will come. Now, as you said, the people who really participated in this protest were largely of two groups. One, young Iranians. They were from 18 to 25 years old. Some statistics say 85% in the streets were this group, who are unemployed and really have very little hope for the future. And the second group were the poor people, and particularly in smaller towns, and outlying regions. Now, we saw that Tehran and some other large cities didn't really make a big move, and particularly Tehran, because Tehran has really colonized the nation in the last 40 years. Tehran's per capita income, on the average, in Tehran, is twice as much as the per capita average of the anywhere else in the nation. Tehranis really have won after the election, but what Tehranis, not the poor Tehranis, a few on the very top, and the middle class, particularly the upper section of the middle class has won significantly. So, and that's why they did not participate. But I have bad news for the government. Even this group is losing. Even this group is losing as we move forward. That is, they're going to lose economically more, particularly because I don't see that the President Rouhani's government will be able to deliver anything more than what it has, and that his so-called neoliberal economic policy is a disaster for a nation that has gone through a revolution and a people that had expected economic justice, reform, and development. Ladies and gentlemen, no country ever in the world has developed in the first stages of its life through neoliberalism. Every state I know, from South Korea to China to anywhere else, the role of the state in the early stages have been the most significant, including here in Qatar or UAE and elsewhere. But what kind of a state? A state that is lawful, disciplined, and not corrupt. It's unfortunate to say that this is not the state we have in Iran. I wanted to stop here, okay, and take questions on my own plan for Iran of the future and others who are putting plans as well.
Thank you so much, Professor Amir Ahmadi, for laying the multiple dimensions of Iran's internal challenges. Before going on, I'd like to ask you a very short question. You're very vocal when it comes to criticism vis-a-vis the Rouhani administration. But what about the shortcomings of the previous administration under Mr. Ahmadinejad?
Yeah, well, we say we don't wash the fault with fault. Okay, I have my own criticism of Ahmadinejad's government. Okay, I call Ahmadinejad representative of the illiterate representative of the poor people. Okay, but Rouhani is a tricky representative of the wealthy. Okay, so they are very different. Rouhani represents the wealthy, the rich. Okay, we call the ashrafs, the nobility, the people who really have it, and Ahmadinejad, the poorer sections. I believe both have mismanaged the country significantly, but in a completely different ways. For example, over the last 5 years, ladies and gentlemen, the per capita income not only has declined, but as I said, the poor people have become poorer under President Rouhani. That's not fair.
Yeah, but I mean, many of the problems that the Rouhani administration had to face were remainders of the Ahmadinejad's period as well, right? So whatever we see, for example.
Well, again, it's just like the story. It's just like the story of Trump and Obama. Every administration blames the previous one. Now, I'm not saying that Ahmadinejad's government is blameless, but believe me, give Iran tomorrow to me. That's why I wanted to become president. I correct that country in 2 years.
Okay.
It's very easy. Iran is a very wealthy country. Iran has no problem. It has the second largest oil reserves, the second largest gas reserve, the fourth largest oil, minerals, 80 million people, most of them are educated and intelligent. What Iran lacks? Nothing but a good government.
Professor,
a government that follows law and discipline.
Thank you so much. So since we're not at a campaign rally, so let us move on to now to the external challenges. And we are happy to have Mr. Sajjad Poor with us, who is a long-standing Iranian career diplomat with a lot of wisdom and wit, if I may say so. Since the mid-2000s, Iran has established itself in the wake of the US-led occupation of Iraq as something like an indispensable power in West Asia. And ever since, we have seen a lot of geopolitical victories of Iran, also during the last few years. And what many see is that today, Iran is engaged in so many theaters of conflict across the region, so that it may be overstretched somehow. And the question is, how do you manage that against the background of the internal challenges that also require a lot of, financial and other attention? So perhaps you could, talk a bit about, Iran's regional policies and ambitions, because there's a lot of various interpretations. But before doing that, let us start by asking you, who runs Iran's foreign policy?
No more question.
No, thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let me start by assalamu alaikum to my colleagues here and expressing my sense of appreciation to you and your colleagues in the Brookings Doha Center for inviting me. Before going to the, let's say, answering the questions, I would like to have a disclaimer that my participation tonight here is not official. If it was official, I had to respond to what Professor Ahmadi said from the beginning and reject him from A to Z. I don't have much hair, but I have two hats. I teach, and my main job is teaching. Of course, I also, I'm in diplomatic, let's say, interaction. So what I say tonight is of my own scholarly hat. And usually in conferences, since you heard so much of tough issues, I start by a joke for disclaim. And the joke, Professor Amir Ahmad, is a joke. He's saying, what's the difference between a camel, a professor, and a diplomat? Have you heard it? No. A camel can work and not drink for a month, and nothing will happen, because this is the way that goes. And a diplomat, with all due respect to diplomats here, they can drink for a month and not work, and nothing will happen. Yeah. And professors and think tankers can work, drink, go to conferences, have comments, answering questions, and nothing will happen. So in that spirit, let me have my own professorial answer to your question. I think, first of all, let me challenge the title of this panel, if I'm allowed to. The title is Challenges of Iran. Why just challenges? Should we start by assumption that Iran is exclusively about challenges, or it is also opportunities and capabilities and capacities? Is the picture as dark as we heard, or there are other elements in the picture if we are a scholarly and an analytical track? But, however, going beyond the challenging of the title of Challenges of Iran, I think on the foreign policy that you asked, all of these questions that you raised and the question that I had to work on the challenges of foreign policy, I think there is a fundamental challenge for Iran, and that is the challenge of understanding Iran's foreign policy, how Iran foreign policy should be understood. There are reductionist approaches which reduce Iranian foreign policy to single issues. There are very simplistic notions of Iranian foreign policy, and there are other, let's say, way of looking at Iranian foreign policy which is very political and everyone has its own narratives. I think in order to have a better understanding of Iranian foreign policy and the questions that you raised, one needs to look at what Iranian foreign policy is and what Iranian foreign policy is not. This answers the setting of your question. In answering this fundamental question, I have ABC. A, alarmistic Iran is an erroneous notion. It is 40 years that we all hear about Iranian threats, an alarmistic notion that this country is dangerous, its behavior is dangerous, its nature of the political system is dangerous, its capabilities is dangerous, its, let's say, being in the region is dangerous. And I think these have proven to be, these notions are dangerous, not Iranian foreign policy. Why? Because they have inflamed Iranophobia. It has contributed to wars. Don't forget that Saddam Hussein started its war against Iran with the help of some of regional players on the notion that Iran is a threat. And I think this continues till today, and this is not what Iran foreign policy is. Iran as a nation state is for its security, like any other nation state. It's for well-being, and Iranian foreign policy is based on the national interest of Iran as a nation state. My B is what I call builder Iran. Iran is a builder. Iran is a builder with respect specifically to your question in the region. Suppose that Iran was not in the region. We all know that Damascus was on the verge of collapse. And ISIS was, I think, 30, 40 kilometers to Baghdad. So what Iran did, Iran provided security to the region. Furthermore, here I have to underline that Iran is the only country, regardless of to what Professor Ahmadi said, I think one of the most fundamental achievements of Iranian revolution, which is proudly can be pronounced by anybody, is its independence. And independence is the most important for me as a person in foreign policy studies and foreign policy practice. I think is the most fundamental element of Iranian polity today. And through its dependence, Iran is the only country which is producing its security independently. No other country in this region is providing its security domestically by itself. Furthermore, Iran is providing security for the region. And Iran is a builder in this regard. And regardless of what they say, Iran is building bilateral relationship, trilateral ones. I don't want to go to detail of what happened during last July here and the Iranian role. Don't forget that Qatar was strangled, and what Iran did opened is not just a space. I think Iran was, by words and action, proved that it is building relationship based on mutual interest and so on and so forth. My C is a cooperative Iran. Iran is cooperative in its foreign policy. JCPOA may be looked from different angles, but it's sign of Iranian global cooperation and crisis management. It prevents a global crisis, a regional crisis. Cooperation regionally, let me here focus on recent statements by our foreign minister at Munich conference last week, that we are for a regional dialogue. A regional dialogue is what he has emphasized. It's the base of cooperation dialogue. So he even introduced concepts of network security as well as a strong region. A strong region means I cannot be strong and my neighbor be weak. We need a type of interconnectivity and interdependence of interest among neighborhood, and this is the base of security. I don't want to give a rosy picture of what Iranian foreign policy is, but it is 40 years. You know, I was young when actually I entered this business of scholarly conferences, and I'm happy to hear, to see actually. First of all, I'm happy that I'm alive to see the 40th anniversary of revolution, but always there had been prediction about the collapse of Iran, Iran being so, Iran is being weakened, Iran being so and so. And Iranian revolution, which is supported by Iranian people, including the 3 weeks ago on the anniversary of revolution, is a defiance to all this pseudo-scholarly prediction about the weaknesses of Iran, or what I started, misunderstanding on Iran. So may I ask all of us to revisit our understanding. It is hard when there are cliches, when there are narratives dominating in the field, in the press, and Iran is depicted a dangerous one, Iran is to really challenge. But look, what have we done? And compare what the others in the region have done to this country and what Iran has done. So I think the most important challenge is the challenge of understanding and misunderstanding and what I call cognitive mapping. And we need a redrawing of the cognitive map.
Thank you, Dr. Sajjadpour. You portrayed Iran's regional policies as being primarily of a defensive nature.
Sure.
And acting somehow of a benign hegemon.
Not hegemon, I didn't use the word.
Or benign, I said benign. So
benign
because
actor. Benign
Iran
actor.
is providing security for the region.
Yeah.
This is how you put it. But if you look, of course, I mean, there are different areas of Iranian operations, and with the West, we've seen constructive engagement leading to the JCPOA. But in the region, Iran's policies has not been viewed as constructive engagement. Do you understand part of the criticism that might be leveled against Iran's Syria policy, or do you think that everything Iran did there is primarily a fight against Daesh?
Good question. First of all,
a very short answer, please.
No, your phrase is replete of concepts and issues, and then you want me to be short.
No, it was a question.
First on hegemony. Iran is against hegemony, rejects hegemony, and furthermore believes that hegemony is impossible, either by regional players or by global players. The era of hegemony is gone. Second, there are so many views in the region. Of course, you have Israeli Zionist view, you have radical, what is our job is to detect which view corresponds to reality. Now, the third point on Syria. Iran didn't start Syrian war. You read WikiLeaks, you read the documents. It was about cutting the neck of Iran in the Levant. It means that, yes, it was an uprising, but it was hijacked by a strategic calculation, especially when you had regime change in Libya, by a political technology being used by external powers, then intervening, then rupture of the society. The same was happening in Syria, and the plan was to do the same in Iran, and the plan was to continue it in Russia. This is not, let's say, an Iranian reading. I have heard it from a Russian strategist. So what Iran did was 100% defensive in Syria. We didn't intervene. Actually, you see some actors in the region who are historically reactionary, means very, very reactionary in their thinking, but they became what I call revolutionary reactionary. They wanted to change regimes from outside by military forces, militarization of the process. This is what happened.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sajjadpour. Dr. Ghabra, Professor Ghabra, if one listens to the discourse on Iran in the Arab world, one is not sure if it's about legitimate concerns or if it's some kind of an Iranophobia, as Mr. Sajjadpour put it. How can we best distinguish between what is legitimate concern and what is paranoia inside a geopolitical game of rivalry between, on one hand, the Islamic Republic of Iran and on the other, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? And what about the Arab project? Is there an Arab project? What about do they have, is there a future of the Arab project that might be able to contain what some might perceive as Iran's expansive policies?
Thank you. I mean, I will answer the question on the Arab project maybe later, because the first one deserves some attention. So on the one hand, Iran is an important player, an important country in the region. One understands its role historically and in the present time. Iran is a country that may have and does have many concerns in its relation to the West, in its relation to the USA, in its relation to Zionism, and it does share with many Arabs an outlook regarding independence, regarding Zionism, regarding issues of threats that surround the region. So on the one hand, one sees that highly important country alongside Turkey in an Islamic context, alongside other Arab countries, but with our focus on Iran, a country that feels a threat as a result of its nature of revolution, of independence, of seeking its own project. One sees all of that. But on the other hand, there is a series of issues that made Iran lump the entire Arab world in one basket. Its project went in certain directions. It overplayed the sectarian side of the project. That doesn't mean others did not in the region. But since we are talking about Iran, it overplayed the sectarian approach. And by doing so, it lost populations it could have gained in the region. There are entire populations that looked highly towards Iran's revolution in 1979. And lots of them, over time, feel different. So to look more concrete, let's take Iraq. Well, there was a change of regime in 2003. The US could not fill the vacuum. Iran did. Okay, no problem. But what happened later is that Iran became very much involved in the Iraqi situation, to the point that even within the Shia blocs, those who are not close to Iran will suffer serious consequences, whether in elections or in overall representation. So in a way, there was an authoritarian, there was a domination project. Now, is this a function of fear from Iran's side, the 8-year war with Iraq? That Iraq should never be strong again and should never be united again? I see that. But that's the wrong policy. Because if it stays in that direction, it is destined to create forces within the Shia bloc, let aside others, to try to salvage Iraq into a country that is friendly with its surroundings, but equally friendly with Iran. There is a difference between being friendly to Iran and being a surrogate, being a follower, being a weak state that its politics is determined in Tehran. Now, I ask myself sometimes, there is also a marginalization of the Najaf at the expense of Najaf. There is a sense of Persianization in the south of Iraq. How true is this? How deep is it? But there is something going on in that direction, and it has an impact. So as Iran was struggling against the US and Zionism and also as it is struggling against certain Arab states and regimes, Saudi Arabia, one of them, it overplayed the sectarian game and it overextended its power. Now, when I look at Syria, on the other hand, but before going to Syria, even the ISIS issue, the ISIS story, if the Sunnis were not marginalized at that level, ISIS would not have emerged. Iran could have played a much wiser policy that would have not allowed such a marginalization to take place in Iraq by which ISIS. And now, if there is a vacuum, again and again, we are destined to further conflict. So if I go to Syria, the first 6 months of the Syrian revolution was very, very peaceful. The Syrian regime, from day one, said there are armed bands behind the revolution. There is no proof at all. The Syrian rebellion was youthful, peaceful, dominated by young, just demonstrating, and as a result, the regime decided to be very brutal. And I know that the Iranians are aware how brutal the Syrian regime is. Iran is not like the Syrian regime. It's a much more, it's a post-revolutionary country. It has different institutions. It has balances of power. It has right and left and center. True, it has authoritarian practices in its regime, but it is a state that has a structure. And that structure produced at a certain time President Khatami, produced at a certain time other reformers, Rafsanjani, it produced all kinds of trends. The Syrian regime is a one-sided, one-dimensional, extremely brutal security apparatus. And to let the Syrians be massacred, the civilians, in the first 6 months, slowly, you ended up with the Syrian army, slowly defectors came out of the Syrian army, and that's how the Syrian Free Army came to exist. So I would have expected Iran to talk to the Syrian Free Army and not let others talk to the Syrian Free Army. Iran could have had dialogue with Syrian rebels that were at the center. And there were those who were at the center. It wasn't, Nusra was not there from the beginning. So was the case. ISIS was not there from the beginning. Iran could have played its cards better in Syria and better. Unfortunately, it played to the hands of those who wanted to isolate Iran in the region as a project, as an idea, as an independent country, as an anti-Zionist entity, as an anti-imperialist country. Those who wanted to isolate the Iran approach were able to create a fracture, a total split between Sunnis and Shiites. So everybody contributed to this Sunni-Shia war of attrition, which in a way contributed to the counter-revolution in the region after 2/11, where the young people in the region wanted freedom, equality, justice, better life, better jobs, respect. They didn't want to be tortured, thrown in jail for no other reason. The Syrian regime went in this direction. Other regimes in the region were all in this direction. It was expected that Iran would have been able to pick up that moment. It didn't. Now, I am not of the opinion that our ally should be in the Arab world, the Israelis against the Iranians. No, Iran is part of this dynamic of the region. It is a country that is a neighbor to all of the Arab world. It is not a settler colonial country. It is not a colonial country. It is not an imperialist country. It is a country we have differences with, but yet we need to have dialogue with. And I do strongly believe that dialogue is important and clarifying the fact. And I also realize that whatever has happened in history can always be corrected. But that correction has to be understood at every level. So again, I think that the Arab world is passing through a stage where people would feel, would want to live a true expression with democratization, justice, equality. The slogans of 2/11 will keep coming back. And I keep looking for an Iranian voice there in Iran, as much as in the neighboring states in the region of the Arab world, as well as in the world, voices that can understand that process and ally with it, rather than marginalize it and repress it.
Thank you so much, Professor Abra. Since we have almost 30 minutes left, and I think all the panelists somehow interacted with each other in their respective remarks, I would like to invite the audience to participate in the discussion. And since we're all male panel, I would especially encourage also the ladies and the female participants. And of course, we didn't, for example, talk about the JCPOA and the future of it, and the potential reactions from Iran, but I'm sure it will be among the questions. So please, I see. Yes.
There's a female there, no?
Okay, where's the mic actually? Oh, okay, all right. So there's a lady here. We're going to start over there, and then the gentleman over there in the middle.
طيب السلام عليكم. بطرح السؤال بالعربي إذا ممكن. تمام؟
Sure.
Sorry?
عربي.
Oh.
شوي.
So first on, and then exactly. Please go.
تمام. كان مفترض يكون في فرصة للتحضير، بس بما أنه ما في امرأة رفعت يدها راح أباشر بالسؤال مباشرة. فسؤالي للأستاذ سعيد، قال بأن موقف إيران في سوريا هو موقف دفاعي، لكنه لم يوضح كيف يكون هذا الموقف دفاعي، خصوصاً وأن مثل ما وضح دكتور شفيق الغبرة كانت الثورة في البداية سلمية، وكانوا حتى السوريين حينما
said when the Syrians first started demonstrating, were calling for reforms, Iran came to the help of the Syrian regime to enable it to continue to oppress its own people. Even if we place this in the context of the region, how can Iran, after all these crimes committed by the Syrian regime, this regime can remain a strategic ally of Iran, whether in the short term or the long term? شكرا جزيلا.
The question was about Iran's Syria policy and how far it is
That's for me.
defensive or
Difficult questions for me.
it is supporting a repressive regime. So yes, so we're going to collect 3 questions.
No problem.
Yes, please.
أيضا سؤال بالعربي.
Oh, also in Arabic? Okay.
Arabic. Testing translation, testing translation, 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, testing translation, 1 2 3 1 2 3, testing translation, 1 2 3 1 2 3. First of all, I'll introduce myself. I am the ambassador of Free Syria in the state of Qatar. Syria, which dreams of peace, security, away from Russian occupation and Iranian occupation and the occupation by the criminal Syrian regime of our country. I'm not being diplomatic at all because there is a lot of things which were said which provoked me, especially when the Republic of Iran is supposedly a respected country. It's present in our region. We respect it. We respect its interests. But we think the Iranian dream, since the Battle of the Car, is still in the hearts and minds of Iranian politicians. And after the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah and what happened in Iran, in Iraq, in the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, Iran has a Persian project. Iran has a chauvinistic, nationalist Persian project, and it has never denied its animosity and hatred of the Arabs for many reasons, many years, because of its because of the nature of its الرجاء توجيه السؤال. إذا لديك سؤال إذا وصلت فكرتك.
لا بس سؤال خليه.
هل
طيب ما بدنا نكمل؟
هو الترجمة فيها يمكن مشكلة، مش عم بسمعك منيح.
Please be brief in your question. ملاحظاتك وصلت. My question then, why does Iran now is resorting to deliberate demographic changes in Damascus? And the gentleman said Iran has protected Damascus. We have proof that the capital of the Amawites, there are serious attempts, real attempts, sometimes by using threats, sometimes by using money and other incentives to change the status of this capital, which is more than 10,000 years old. What I need here is a clear and transparent answer.
Question, the gentleman here at the front.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. When I speak about Iran and Arabs, I have to exclude totally Shi'i and Sunni. The Iranian, there is no Ali ibn Abu Talib. The Sunnah, there is no Umar ibn al-Khattab. Please don't try to speak about this terms. What I say, all interests. What concerning me, Israeli-American-Iranian relations. When Qasim Soleimani was fighting ISIS in Iraq with Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi under alliance cover, which is America and Arab financing, $500 million. When he killed the Barazani dream in making a state for Kurds there in Qasim Soleimani killed the dream in 2 days, was supported by Americans. Hezbollah went to fight in Syria was with the cover of Israel and allowance, permission of Israel. What I say, please, now, that American is encouraging for what is called the Shi'i crescent against a Sunni. They're going to destroy each other, and as in Iraq, now after was destroyed, they need $100 million for restoring. So this is America. We have to be wise, as Dr. Al-Ghabra said. Why no dialogue must be between these people and these people? Please save us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're gonna first ask Dr. Sajjadpour. I think most of the questions were directed to you.
Okay.
Before we go on to a second round, so there were basically the first two questions specifically on the rationale and on the kind of relationships with the Assad regime in Syria.
Yeah. You know, the Syrian case is a very complex case. There are so many emotions involved. I understand the emotions. As a person, as an individual, as a Muslim, as a Shia, as an Iranian, I have sympathy with the victims everywhere. Victims of aggression, suppression, and so on and so forth. So our heart goes with those who are victims. But the question is, who is the victim, who is the aggressor, when there are so many actors involved and so many strategic plans on the scene. Iranian revolution is against aggression, is against suppression, and is against any violation of human rights, wherever it is. And I think this is the, let's say, the very true human dimension of all conflicts, including what is in our region today. But I think there is another level, that's a strategic calculation, which misuses emotions, even weaponizes human rights, weaponizes humanitarian dimensions, and misuses everything for the strategic calculation and changing the political map of the region. So what happened in Syria was not just about human right or humanitarian dimension. It was also about changing the geopolitics of region. It was a macro social engineering in the region. This is where the interest of everybody was involved, and I think you have to keep in mind when you analyze, you have to have this broader strategic perspective. Third layer also is needed to be taken into account, and that is the political level. I think there should be a huge work done to solve this issue politically, because there is no military solution for this crisis. And I think here is where every actor, including Iran, should play a role, which we are trying to do, as we have done with Astana process, we have done with Sochi process, and the other processes to contain the, let's say, the upheaval and find a political solution which is in the hands of Syrians. And it's not up to the others to really impose any solution on Syrians. Regime change from outside, as I said, is a strategic miscalculation. The victim of this strategic miscalculation were not just Syrians, I think the others in the region. Now on the question of demographic change in Damascus, which was very new for me to hear. Actually, it's what I mentioned in the beginning on misunderstandings of Iran, which is very there. I mean, it is so easy to blame Iran for every misdoing that's happening in this region. And Iran is used as a card for the inefficiency of every player in this region. How we can change the demography of Damascus? Damascus is dear for us, not because of just a strategic calculation. I think it's a historical place, it's a cultural place, and I think all this comes to the picture. But I think it is easy to really talk about Iranian project, but how you prove it's a project? I think to talk about Iranian project by itself is a project. You see, now on the Syrian, on the Sunni Shia, I have really to have a footnote on Dr. Professor Gabros, which I found his analysis interesting, and I have high respect for him. Not today, from many years ago. But I think Shia Sunni was used as a narrative when the era of Saddam Hussein was ended in 2003. After the collapse of Saddam Hussein, there was a new era in Iraq in which the long-time domination of a minority over the majority was ended. And there was a constitution in which one man, one vote became the base. Then they said, oh, this is sectarian. And then the originality of this issue started then, and then they tried to use the sectarian for emotionalization of the region. Iran is against sectarian. Find any statement by the Iranian key leaders which is supportive of sectarian. You cannot find. Iranian revolution was about the unity of Muslims. It is in the Iranian constitution. But the sectarian narrative is used by many players to really emotionalize the situation and to really compensate their own deficiencies. My final point, which I, again, very quickly, on Professor Gabro, I thank him for bringing the issue of Israel to the picture. I mean, here for the last 2 days, I hear, and I have been seeing many people, the issue of, Iran being the danger has become so inflamed that now it seems that some Arabs, I don't say it's Arab population, it's still the Arab population, the absolute majority of Arabs hate the Zionist entity. But Zionist entity is using these narratives to justify the, let's say, cooperation with some of the Arab players, which I think are acting against the interests of their people.
Thank you, Dr. Sajadpour. I mean, we still have this gulf of perceptions when it comes to Iran's own role and the perception of Iran's role, and I think we don't have really, unfortunately, the time to talk about the details, but let me just say that there are not only emotions, but there are also facts that one side of the Syrian equation is much more brutal, perhaps, than the other side, and that Iran might have overplayed its hand somehow.
You cannot, no, look, either you cannot have a comment or you have to my counter.
No, you can come back.
Is ISIS less brutal than the others? Is ISIS less brutal? And wasn't ISIS supported by some players in the region?
Thank you. Very short, very, very short.
Yeah, well, I
because
just wanted
you have to go for the second round.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring perhaps this foreign and domestic issues together, as if we are speaking as if there is a domestic Iran policy and a foreign Iran policy. Remember, these are the same players. So the Iranian, let's say, elite, political elite, behaves in the same way in the country that it is behaving outside the country. These are the same people. All right, so there is no two groups. For example, in Iran, the Iranian government thinks Hussein Amir Ahmadi is not with us because he has a tie. He's not a good Muslim. He doesn't pray. He doesn't have beer. And therefore, I am not part of the group. All right? And there is another group that is part of the group, and then the third group that they don't know where they stand. The Islamic Republic's foreign policy from the day one was following. There are three countries in the world. Those who are our enemies, those who are our friends, and those who are suspected to be either friends or enemies. We don't know where they stand. Well, that's the kind of foreign policy that they have followed. From the day one, this Islamic Republic, this theocracy, had an idea of how to manage itself domestically and internationally. Unfortunately, that particular mindset paradigm has failed on both sides. On both sides. I mean, again, I'm not going to blame Iran for everything that has happened outside. I mean, there's no question about it. And I think Dr. Gabra was very fair, and Dr. Sajjadpur has made a few very interesting statements about it. But at the end of the day, we Iranians have to take responsibility for what has happened in the region and in the country, particularly because, as Mr. Gabra and others have said, Iran is a power. Iran is a power in the region. Iran is expected to play differently. Iran is expected to create friends as opposed to enemies. You know, a Chinese proverb says, if you wanted to make me into an enemy, you sure can. I can be an enemy of Dr. Gabra for a second, just in a second. I just make him an enemy. I could also make him a friend. I think Iran has to do its best to make the East, the West, and the region friend as opposed to enemy or people or the government that are suspected. I think they just have to give up on that. I think regionalism is not gone. Believe me, regionalism is right inside Iran. It's everywhere. In fact, the more we have become global, the more we have become local. In fact, the localization and globalization has gone hand in hand. So the fact that we are global means nothing, but we really are in this particular region. Iranians are Muslim. Iranians are part of this political landscape, and they cannot escape from this reality. And therefore, they better face it. They better face it with good faith. You know, I think that's what Iranians have to do, both domestically and outside. There is tremendous pressure on this Islamic Republic to really do structural changes inside and structural changes outside in its foreign policy. Iran's foreign policy, I'm sorry to say, in the constitution is a wrong one. Iran's foreign policy in the constitution is interventionist. So as long as that constitution defines Iran's foreign policy, that foreign policy will stay interventionist, because it says it is the responsibility of the theocracy, okay, to support the movements of the poor people, of the Islamic groups that are being victimized by others, defend them, support them, and go helping them. So when you have that, then you come to here and try to support the poor people. But then again, unfortunately, as I have over and over said, what is the ideology and what's pragmatism has really been very different in Iran. I mean, they have been ideological, but in practice, they really haven't followed a consistent line. Wherever it served them, they have been for the poor. Wherever they haven't served them, they have been against the oppressed, so-called. I think we have to move that on that point.
Thank you, Professor Amir Ahmadi. Do you have a few remarks? Otherwise, we could
go to
the second round.
My only quick remark is that definitely Iran is not to be blamed for all the issues of the region. Definitely, Iran requires a series of understandings vis-à-vis the region. But Iran cannot be, in its mindset, that's the victim of the Iraq-Iran war and then projecting this into the Arab world. I understand the Iraq-Iran war was extremely problematic from the beginning. But Iran cannot be always under the same influence of what has happened during those 8 years. And therefore, it needs to change the paradigm. It needs to look at the Arab world differently, and it has to feel what the Arab population is all going through. It could have interfered in Egypt. Where would this take it? It could have interfered, I mean, the same logic of the region, Syria, why not Egypt? Well, why not Egypt? Why not Libya? Why not Morocco? Why not? Intervention will catch up with Iran and will have very counterproductive impact on it, and it has gotten deep into the grassroots of the populations of the Arab world. I personally believe the nuclear deal was a brilliant deal, and it should continue, and I understand there are forces in the US that want to end that deal and maybe push Iran in a certain direction. We have an interest that Iran comes back to the fold, but comes back to the fold understanding the requirements of that. And to do that, Iran needs to look differently to the region, to the Arab world, to the Syrian situation, to the structures. I understand at the same time the comment that, yes, Iraq was governed by a regime that was a minority, the Saddam Hussein regime. In many of the Arab countries, there is a minority in power. In Syria also, there is a minority. Why should you be with a minority in Syria? And you see, it's the same dynamic in a democracy, in a country that opens up on all its population, Sunni, Shia, Alawi, Christian, Muslim, we will have a better future. And I think Iran is situated to make that change. And the reason maybe I really appreciate that you came to have this dialogue, take it back with you to Iran, because there is a need for a shift, and we will all benefit from that on the regional level in terms of where we're going. This repressive situation, the worst of it is in Syria and Iraq, must not continue, cannot continue. It's a disaster to see it.
Thank you so much, Professor Ghabra, for all those constructive comments. Okay, now we have almost 10 people who want to ask questions, but we're going to go for the last round, and I'm going to, so we're going to start with here, with the lady at the front.
Thank you very much. I'm Noha Abu Dahab from the Brookings Doha Center.
Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
My question is about Iran's foreign policy when it comes to Yemen. As you know, today the Security Council, or certain members of the Security Council, are trying to push for a resolution to condemn Iran for its alleged supply of weapons to the Houthis in Yemen. And so how would you describe Iran's involvement in Yemen? Because it seems to be not so straightforward. Are the Houthis indeed Iranian-backed, as they're often described in the media? And if so, what is the agenda there? And if not, if there isn't, a profound Iranian agenda in Yemen, why are there conflicting messages coming out of the Iranian Foreign Ministry, for instance? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Actually,
last point, the Iranian Foreign Ministry was
conflicting messages on Yemen.
no.
Okay. Now, so where's the mic? Over there. Okay. So we're gonna, over there, the gentleman, yes, behind you. Over there. And the lady here in the second row. Yes, please. But very short, please, like maximum 2 or 3 sentences.
My question is, why Iran is not treating Arab world as treats Turkey? Why always undermine Arab states and dealing with Turkey?
Why Iran is not?
Is when Iran deals with Arab countries, they always sort of undermining Arab states. But when it deals with Turkey, there is sort of respect and, sort of, counting a lot in Turkey and how they deal with different regional issues. To this question, everywhere Iran intervene, there is a case of a failed state. How do you explain this? How do you respond to the perception in the Arab world that where Iran intervened, there was a case of failed state? like Iraq, like Syria, like Yemen? Thank you.
The lady here in the second row. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much for all the speakers, the panel members. One of the issues that was brought up by Dr. Sajjad Poor was the reductionist perspective that we are taking towards Iranian politics. And I would say just to call Iran and its challenges the title itself, and not to talk about what other roles or the roles of other players, not only in the region, but in the Cold War, the superpowers are playing in the dynamics of these nations and in this region, is an underestimation of what is happening in these countries, which definitely should be emphasized. And one of my questions, again from Dr. Sajjad Poor, is that in relation to the narrative that is getting constructed every day by social media and the powers who are controlling the social media in today's world, when something happens to the right of females, for example, in Saudi Arabia, after years of not having a right to vote or to drive, it's magnified and dramatized, and it's become very emphasized. But I also like to see what is the role of females in Iran and Iranian politics, especially with the news stories that are coming up with the movement against hijab and having the freedom and actually the democratization for females as well as males.
Thank you so much, Professor Esmadi. The gentleman at the very back, then the lady in the middle. At the very back.
Raj has a question.
Yes. Very short, please, because we are really running out of time.
Thank you very much. Ran Jalaldin, I'm a visiting fellow here at the Brookings Doha Center. My question for the panel is, what if we were to switch the conversation around and ask...
May you speak in the mic?
Sorry, yes. My question for the panel is, what if we were to switch the conversation around and ask what the Arab world needs to do to develop a more constructive relationship with Iran? Secondly, very briefly, my question is, why do we assume that Iran has overreached or overextended its power, given that from where many people are standing, it's doing quite well in Syria, in Iraq, and indeed, one could say, the rest of the region as well? Thank you.
Thank you. The lady in the middle.
Hello, good evening. Kind appreciation and thanks to our esteemed panel members and Brookings Center for organizing this notion. Iran has reputable history and significant input in many sectors, but as the deleterious image the Republic carries, economically speaking, Iran is full of talented young men and women in terms of workforce and rich expertise. However, internationally, it's not a member of WTO yet and suffered for many years from the sanctions. Now with the promising step that after the nuclear agreement was signed between the previous American administration and one of the largest markets was interested in having a trade exchange with Iran, especially, you know, after Trump's waiving the decline of
Sorry, what is the
agreements.
question? What is the question?
I'm getting to the question,
Yes.
I'm so sorry. I just do understand that Iran would like to protect its borders with Syria and Iraq and all that stuff, you know. But as Professor Shafiq said, Iran government doesn't treat its people like Iraq or Syria, but either doesn't treat them like Sweden or Germany. I'm seeing here that the all capacity to be a great country again should be to solve internal issues, especially the mechanism can be adopted to overcome the high number of unemployment and poverty. How it can create jobs to the skilled young men and women, and how it can encourage the SMEs without trading off the effort to change the negative image while enforcing certain foreign policy to reach stronger partnership with China, Europe, and strategic countries. My question is for Mr. Hushang. and Professor Ahmadi, and also for Mr. Professor
Thank you
Shafiq.
so much.
Thank you.
Okay, now so basically we don't have any, I'm really sorry because we have to close in 10 minutes. So if you want to ask questions, then you will not hear any answers. So we don't have any choice, I'm so sorry, to go over to the panel now. So what I'm going to ask each of you is to give some kind of an opening to the future. Perhaps you can, besides answering to the questions very briefly, I would suggest. Can you say something precise in terms of what Iran can do to create confidence with many of its neighbors, specifically in Iraq and in Syria? And perhaps Professor Amir Ahmadi can talk more about, perhaps a few words on Iran's civil society, and also how do you see the prospect of reform within the Islamic Republic. And last but not least, Professor Ghabra can shed some light on what the Arab world or what powerful Arab actors can do to effect positive change or perception of Iran.
So should I start with Professor Ghabra?
You should perhaps start with what Iran can do.
I think before going to that question on Yemen, we have no involvement. The only involvement we have is our sympathy goes with the victim, and that is the people of Yemen, who are the victim of an aggression for the last 3 years. And I think Iran is absolutely no major player, but Iran is used by others, including United Kingdom in the recent proposal in the United Nations, which wasn't, of course, agreed upon for really justification of the wrongdoings of the others. But our sympathy is with the people of Yemen. On Dr. Mahjoub Zawahiri's question, why Iran is not dealing with the Arab world as Turkey, first of all, there is a wrong assumption in this question. There is no unanimous Arab world. We have relationship with different Arab nations, and Iran is not on one side, the Arab world on the other side. We have one of the best relationship with the state of Qatar today, with Sultanate of Oman. We have good relation with North African nation of Tunisia. So you cannot use this. Actually, I'm surprised by scholars of making that general statements. I think it is wrong. And Iran has not intervened in the Arab world, the latter part of your question, when it is a failed state. I think, first of all, there is no intervention. And I think what Professor Ahmad referred to, Constitution, is a misreading of the Constitution. The Constitution is not for intervention in the affairs. It is for supporting the aspiration of people. What Arab world can do, I think, is a very fundamental question. And that is to forget demonization of Iran, not Arab world. I think some players in the Arab world, not all of them. Now, what can we do on Iraq and Syria? I think this is the question you have to ask from, because we are not the custodian of Iraqis. Regardless of what they say, Iraq is an independent state, a sovereign state. Actually, the question by itself begs the answer. Syria is also a sovereign state. We are not running Syria or running Iraq. I think what we have been interactively there is for helping based on the request of the government, but I think generally there should be more bilaterals, more mini regional dialogue. Here, I would end that regional dialogue is key, and Iran is for regional dialogue, is on the record, and is emphasizing on that, because the destiny of the region should not be decided by Trump and his son-in-law. It should be decided by the people in the region.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sajjadpour. Let's go to Professor Amir Ahmadi.
All right. Thank you. I wonder if this meeting was in Tehran, what kind of questions people would ask and what would be the concern be. I would say 95% about Iran, 5% about the outside of the 5%, 4.5% about the US, and then with that other, a quarter percent or what about the Arab world.
You are all invited to Tehran.
This is absolute. So I think if this was, I think this really is a very important point, because I think the way you guys are looking at Iran is just looking at a behavior from outside. You're seeing Iran outside. You are not seeing Iran from inside. Iran is all about inside. This is a regime that is born of a revolution. And for the last 40 years, it has been struggling to find a place for itself in the international community and something to build in domestically that will be acceptable. Unfortunately, it hasn't yet come up with a solution for either side. As I said, domestically, Iran has tremendous problems and is trying to deal with it. I mean, there are all kinds of social, political, civil society groups that are proposing different things. A group is trying to overthrow the regime. Others who have now proposed referendum, to determine the future political system in the country. Even the reformists inside the country are saying things are not working. The former Iran's president, Ahmadinejad, writes to the supreme leader, says, please get rid of this government and this judiciary system and the parliament. Clean up. I personally myself wrote an article with the title, Mr. Khamenei, please clean up the system. That was the title. The thing is, Iran has a tremendous problem inside, and as long as that side is not cleaned up, you cannot expect changes in international community, in the West, in the region. The biggest problem Iran faces in its foreign policy is still U.S.-Iran relations. And that U.S.-Iran relation mirrors also its relation with the Israel. So the Iran's criteria in dealing with the Arab world is who is on the U.S. side or who is working with Israel. If you are working with Israel and you are with the U.S., you automatically become the Islamic Republic's enemy. This is the way the revolution saw things from the day one. So I spent 30 years on U.S.-Iran relations, trying to normalize that particular relations. And I believe and continue to believe, unless that relation is normalized, neither Iran can domestically jump, make a leap forward, nor it can change its foreign policy regionally. It will stay. The key is U.S.-Iran relations. If I was you all guys, I will do everything to try to make that relation normal, because everything will follow. And that's the way we have learned from history. If you look at the history of Iran before the revolution, you will see that when Iran was a friend of the West and the US, it also was living in peace and harmony with the Arab world, and with Israel, and with everybody else. So as long as that problem stays, I am not very hopeful that the problems in Syria and Iraq, in Yemen, and everywhere else will be resolved with Iran. They are not the real issue. They are the symptoms of what happens in Iran and its relationship with big powers, and particularly, I mean, the United States of America. So that's my last point I wanted to make.
Thank you so much. Professor Ghavra.
Well, maybe the first time I met Professor Sayyid Muhammad was in Pennsylvania in the USA.
20 years ago.
Then he was not allowed to go 20 miles outside of New York. He had to get a special permission to come to Pennsylvania to the university. We both had a panel. And that was in 2000 or 1999, 2000.
1999.
So 1999, 2018, wow, a lot have changed.
A lot.
And besides the gray hair here and there, and so many other things, yet the region in our part of the world, the Arab world, because the question was, what can the Arab world do? And the Arab world is also different worlds, different places, different voices. I believe there is a population voice, there is a people's voice. My recommendation, Iran needs to listen to the people's voice, to the population's voice. Iran came as a result of a people's revolution. And I expect Iran to come out with a vision that can connect with the people of the Arab world, independent of sectarianism. Sectarianism will come and go. I understand there was times these religious forces came to the helm in Iran, maybe during the Iran-Iraq war in particular. But the times are changing fast, and the sectarian paradigm is a doomed paradigm. We need to get out of it in order to find a way for all of us to live in the region. So Iran can connect with that. On the other hand, I realize that we in the Arab world do have a duty to create the dialogue, to create the understanding, but Iran is a much more powerful player. My recommendation would be is that there is no end to the Syrian war. I believe the Syrian situation, not only the revolution, it ended up becoming a series of wars, civil wars. Now we have a series of wars. I see that going on for several years to come. Where would Iran want to go in it? My recommendation, Iran needs to take a step backward, several steps backward. It should do the same in Iraq. It should look for partners, not followers. And when it starts looking at people, that's one paradigm. Partners, not followers, that's the other paradigm. I think Iran will find its way in the Arab world in a much better way than the one followed in the last few years, since 2011, 12, 13, 14, until now. There has to be a paradigm shift in the Iranian situation. Now, from the Arab side, yes, we need to have a clear stand against any of the bases, US bases in the region being used against Iran. We need to have a clear stand against anybody calling for the Israelis to make a strike against Iran. We need to make a clear stand that the nuclear agreement is a good agreement. At least it allows Iran to manage without going nuclear. And hopefully the sanctions be lifted. And it is in our interest that happens. But at the same time, it's our interest that Iran makes a shift. Dialogue is a way, one way of doing all of this. But the other one is it's going to be clear on the ground. Iran will not be able to see a settlement to Syria. Neither the Russians, nor the Iranians, nor the Americans, nor the Turks, nobody is going to see an end as long as so many issues are volcanically happening in a dynamic way on the ground. There are 5, 6 wars going on, and it could go regional. And that also applies to Iraq. There is an attempt for the rebuilding of Iraq, but without a good understanding of equality and partnership and justice. So this region is now about justice, equality, looking for a better future, a stability based on respect for people's rights. That's at the foundation of the story of this, the narrative of the region since 2011. And I do believe there is another round and another round and another round in a region that cannot settle until it reaches some sort of an understanding on its major issues. And without that, everybody getting involved in it will only get stuck in a very complicated regional situation. And maybe the Iranians, having gone through a revolution in the past, can better understand this. And I recommend this discussion taken back, so our dialogue will continue. And I appreciate
I just wanted to say one more. They said that I heard that it says that Iran has to build partnership as opposed to followership. But the problem is with the clergy in Iran, they don't believe in partnership. They believe in followership. They are the kind of people, they like followers. They don't like partners. See, that's the problem. I'm telling you, there's a structural problem.
But you see, one point is that once you try a fellowship, and it's a disaster, and it ends up without results, then you need to change. Because if I go back to history, we had an 8-year Iraq-Iran war. And what happened after 8 years? We were exactly at the same borders, at the same place, but with 1 million killed and injured, with 2 countries destroyed. You see, politics in this part of the world becomes so futile. So maybe we learn from this and we move on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we had quite an interesting discussion tonight, although many of the questions could not be answered satisfyingly. I think we opened the entire spectrum of the debate surrounding Iran's internal and external challenges, the interplay between Iran's domestic and foreign policy, the interplay in the geopolitics of the region, in the rivalry primarily between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also the role of great powers and superpowers, the United States and Russia and others. So I think what we have, been achieving tonight at least, is to open the entire spectrum of the debate, and we are happy to continue, of course, the discussion. Let me lastly point your attention to 2 other events of the Brookings Doha Center. The next one on March 7th on International Women's Day, and another one the week after on North Africa. So you're more than welcome to attend also those public discussions, and my apologies to those who could not raise their questions tonight. Let me thank our dear panelists for engaging in a very frank and candid discussion tonight, and all of you have a good night. Thank you.